The autumn rain fell softly on the stone walls of Clarence House as Officer Thomas Bridgewater stood at his post near the East Corridor. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time he had learned one golden rule: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. The royal family valued their privacy above all else, and a good guard knew when to become invisible. Thomas adjusted his uniform and glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight, well past the time when most of the household staff had retired for the evening. The hallways were quiet except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. He had been assigned to this particular section of the residence for the past 3 months, a routine posting that rarely involved anything more interesting than escorting the occasional late-night visitor or checking locked doors. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air that Thomas couldn't quite explain. Earlier in the evening he had noticed unusual activity. Several senior palace officials had arrived without any prior announcement in the schedule. Cars had come and gone through the private entrance, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Something was happening, though no one had bothered to inform the guards about what it might be. Around 11:30, Thomas had received an unexpected instruction through his radio. He was to take up a position outside the small drawing room on the second floor. The room was rarely used, tucked away in a corner of the residence where few people ventured. It was the kind of place where private conversations could happen without interruption. The kind of place where secrets were kept. As Thomas climbed the stairs to his new post, he wondered what could be so important. The drawing room was at the end of a long corridor lined with portraits of ancestors long gone. The carpet beneath his feet muffled his footsteps as he approached. A thin line of light showed beneath the door, and he could hear the murmur of voices inside. He took his position beside the door, standing at attention with his hands clasped behind his back. For the first few minutes, Thomas heard nothing but indistinct conversation. Then the voices grew louder, more urgent. He recognized one voice immediately. It belonged to the queen consort, Camilla. Her tone was strained, worried in a way he had never heard before. She was speaking rapidly, her words tumbling over one another. Thomas kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, trying not to listen, but the walls were thin and sound carried. The other voice was male, younger, and equally distressed. Thomas knew it had to be Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage. He had seen Tom around the residence occasionally, though the younger man kept a relatively low profile compared to other members of the extended royal family. Tom's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, and Thomas could hear footsteps pacing back and forth inside the room. Thomas shifted his weight slightly, uncomfortable with the situation. He was close enough to the door that he could hear more than he wanted to. Camilla was saying something about protection, about keeping information contained. Tom's response was defensive, insistent. The conversation had the quality of an argument that had been building for some time, finally reaching its breaking point. Then came the words that made Thomas's blood run cold. Tom's voice rose sharply, cutting through the air like a knife. He was talking about documents, about evidence that could destroy reputations. Camilla's response was immediate and forceful. She told him that some things were better left buried, that the family had weathered storms before and would weather this one too. But Tom wasn't backing down. He insisted that the truth had to come out, that living with lies was destroying him from the inside. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He shouldn't be hearing this. Every instinct told him to step away, to request a replacement, to do anything but stand there and continue listening. But he was frozen in place, bound by duty and by a growing sense that something momentous was unfolding behind that door. He could feel sweat forming on his brow despite the cool temperature in the corridor. The conversation inside shifted. Camilla's voice became softer, more pleading. She was talking about King Charles now, about how fragile things were, how careful they needed to be. Tom interrupted her, his voice thick with frustration. He spoke about years of silence, about protecting people who didn't deserve protection, about the weight of secrets that had become too heavy to carry. Thomas could hear the desperation in his words, the sound of someone who had reached the end of their rope. There was a long pause, and Thomas wondered if the conversation had ended. Then Camilla spoke again, and this time her words were crystal clear. She mentioned a name that Thomas recognized, someone connected to a scandal from years ago that had nearly torn the royal family apart. The case had been closed, the matter settled, or so everyone thought. But according to what Thomas was hearing, there was more to the story. Much more. Tom's response confirmed it. He talked about evidence he had kept hidden, documents that proved the official version of events had been carefully constructed to protect certain individuals. He said he had tried to live with the knowledge, tried to convince himself that staying silent was the right thing to do. But he couldn't do it anymore. The guilt was eating him alive, and he needed to clear his conscience even if it meant facing consequences. Camilla's voice rose in panic. She told Tom that releasing this information would be catastrophic, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire institution of the monarchy. The public trust was fragile, she said, and this revelation could shatter it completely. She begged him to think about what he was doing, to consider the collateral damage, but Tom seemed unmoved. He had made his decision, and nothing she said was going to change his mind. Thomas heard movement inside the room, chairs scraping against the floor, footsteps approaching the door. His heart hammered in his chest as he braced himself, trying to compose his features into the blank expression that guards were trained to maintain. But inside, his mind was racing. He had heard too much, understood too much. Whatever secret they had been discussing, it was explosive enough to threaten the very foundations of the royal family. The door handle began to turn, and Thomas straightened his posture even further. He fixed his gaze on the wall opposite, his face carefully neutral. But he knew that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. He was now a witness to something that powerful people would want kept quiet. And in the world of the royal family, witnesses could be dangerous. The door swung open. Tom Parker Bowles emerged first, his face flushed and his eyes red-rimmed. He walked past Thomas without acknowledging his presence, moving quickly down the corridor as if trying to escape the weight of the conversation he had just endured. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he disappeared around the corner, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Camilla appeared in the doorway moments later. She looked older than Thomas had ever seen her, the lines on her face deepened by worry and exhaustion. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her jacket, and for a brief moment her eyes met Thomas's. There was something in her gaze that made his stomach turn. It was recognition. She knew he had been standing there. She knew he had heard. The queen consort didn't speak. She simply looked at him for what felt like an eternity before turning away and walking in the opposite direction from her son. Thomas remained at his post, his mind spinning with questions and concerns. Should he report what he had heard? To whom would he even report it? And what would be the consequences if he did? He had been a loyal servant of the crown for over a decade, but loyalty became complicated when it involved covering up potentially damaging secrets. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Thomas completed his shift at 6 in the morning and drove home to his small apartment in South London. His wife Sarah was already awake, preparing breakfast for their 2 children before school. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. Sarah had been married to a royal guard long enough to read the signs of stress and worry. Thomas wanted to tell her everything. They had always shared the details of their days, the small frustrations and victories that made up ordinary life. But this was different. This information was dangerous, and involving Sarah would only put her at risk too. So he smiled weakly, blamed his exhaustion on a long shift, and went upstairs to try to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Tom's desperate voice talking about evidence and guilt, and Camilla's panicked response about protecting the monarchy. By noon, Thomas gave up on sleep and went downstairs. Sarah had taken the children to school and left him a note saying she had gone shopping. He made himself coffee and turned on the television, hoping for some distraction. Instead, he found himself watching a news report about the royal family. The reporter was discussing upcoming events, charity work, and the usual carefully managed public appearances. Everything looked perfect, controlled, exactly as it was meant to be. But Thomas now knew there were cracks beneath the surface. His phone rang and he jumped at the sound. The caller ID showed a number from the palace administrative office. Thomas answered, his voice carefully neutral. The woman on the other end was polite but firm. She informed him that his presence was required for a meeting the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. No explanation was given, just the instruction to report to the security office at Clarence House. Thomas thanked her and ended the call, his hands shaking. This was it. They knew he had heard. They were going to ensure his silence, one way or another. Thomas had heard stories over the years about guards who had been quietly dismissed after witnessing things they shouldn't have. Some had signed confidentiality agreements with substantial financial incentives to stay quiet. Others had simply disappeared from royal service, reassigned to positions where they could do no harm. Thomas wondered which fate awaited him. That evening, Sarah sensed his distress and confronted him directly. She demanded to know what was happening, what had him so worried. Thomas looked at his wife of 15 years, the mother of his children, and made a decision. He told her everything. He described the conversation he had overheard, the names mentioned, the implications of what Tom had been threatening to reveal. Sarah listened in silence, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him a simple question that cut to the heart of the matter. What was he going to do? Thomas had been asking himself the same question all day. He could go to the meeting, sign whatever agreement they put in front of him, take any money they offered, and forget everything he had heard. That was the easy path, the safe path. It was what most people in his position would do. But Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Tom's words, about the guilt of keeping secrets, about truth buried for the sake of protecting powerful people. He had joined the Royal Guards because he believed in service, in duty, in doing what was right. And somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that protecting the monarchy was always the right thing. But what if the monarchy was protecting something that shouldn't be protected? What if loyalty to the institution meant being complicit in a cover-up? Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. She told him that whatever he decided, she would support him. But she also reminded him that they had children to think about, a mortgage to pay, a life they had built. Taking on the royal family wasn't like challenging any other employer. They had resources, connections, and power that ordinary people couldn't imagine. If Thomas decided to speak out, there would be consequences that would affect not just him, but everyone he loved. That night, Thomas barely slept again. He lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathing, thinking about his daughters sleeping in the next room. He thought about his father, who had also been a military man who had taught him about honor and integrity. What would his father do in this situation? What was the honorable choice when every option seemed wrong? By morning, Thomas still hadn't decided. He put on his uniform, kissed his family goodbye, and drove to Clarence House. The streets were crowded with the usual London traffic, people going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding behind palace walls. Thomas parked in the staff lot and walked through the familiar corridors to the security office, his heart pounding with each step. The security director was waiting for him, along with two people Thomas didn't recognize. One was a middle-aged woman in an expensive suit, clearly a lawyer. The other was an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, possibly from the royal household management team. They gestured for Thomas to sit, and he did, keeping his expression neutral despite the fear coursing through him. The security director got straight to the point. There had been a situation the previous night involving sensitive family matters. Thomas's position near the private drawing room had been noted. They needed to ensure that any information he might have inadvertently overheard remained strictly confidential. The lawyer slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement with terms that made Thomas's eyes widen. The financial compensation was substantial, enough to change his family's life significantly. But there was something else in the document, a clause buried in the legal language. By signing, Thomas would be agreeing that he had heard nothing of substance, that no information of importance had come to his attention. It wasn't just an agreement to stay quiet. It was an agreement to deny that anything had happened at all. He would be asked to lie, not just through silence, but through active denial, if ever questioned. Thomas looked up at the three faces watching him expectantly, waiting for him to pick up the pen. Thomas stared at the document for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The words blurred on the page as his mind raced through the implications. The lawyer cleared her throat gently, a subtle reminder that they were waiting for his response. The security director folded his hands on the desk, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes watchful. The third man remained silent, simply observing with the patience of someone who had done this before. Before Thomas could speak, the door opened and another figure entered the room. Thomas recognized him immediately. It was Sir Clive Alderton, the principal private secretary to the king and queen consort. His presence elevated the entire situation to a different level. This wasn't just about a guard overhearing something inappropriate. This was about protecting the highest levels of the royal household from potential scandal. Sir Clive nodded to the others in the room before turning his attention to Thomas. His voice was smooth and cultured, the accent of old money and elite education. He spoke about the challenges of royal service, about the unique position of trust that guards held. He mentioned Thomas's exemplary record, his years of dedicated service, his reputation for discretion. Then he pivoted to the matter at hand. The private secretary explained that family disagreements were natural in any household, even royal ones. Sometimes emotions ran high and things were said in the heat of the moment that didn't reflect reality. What Thomas had overheard was simply a family argument, blown out of proportion by stress and misunderstanding. There was no scandal, no cover-up, nothing that warranted concern or attention. It was, Sir Clive assured him, simply a private family matter that had no bearing on anything of public importance. Thomas listened carefully, noting how skillfully the private secretary was reframing the entire situation, the desperation in Tom's voice, the panic in Camilla's responses. The specific details about evidence and buried secrets were all being recast as mere emotional outbursts with no substance behind them. It was masterful manipulation, and Thomas might have believed it if he hadn't heard the conversation himself. The lawyer spoke again, explaining the generous terms of the agreement. Beyond the immediate financial compensation, there would be opportunities for advancement within the royal household security team. Thomas's career could benefit significantly from his discretion in this matter. He could receive specialized training, transfers to more prestigious postings, perhaps even an eventual promotion to a supervisory position. All he had to do was sign the document and forget that the previous night had ever happened. Thomas asked if he could take the document home to review it with his wife. The response was immediate and firm. The agreement needed to be signed now, today, before he left this room. These matters required immediate resolution to prevent any potential misunderstandings or miscommunications. The lawyer assured him that the terms were standard for such situations and entirely fair. There was no need for outside review or consultation. The pressure in the room was palpable. Thomas could feel all eyes on him, waiting for his decision. Part of him wanted to sign, to take the easy way out, to accept the money and the promotions and the promise that everything would be fine. His family would be secure. His career would flourish. All he had to do was pretend he had heard nothing important. But another part of him, the part that his father had instilled with values of honesty and integrity, rebelled against the idea. He thought about Tom Parker Bowles, about the anguish in his voice when he talked about the weight of secrets. Whatever information Tom possessed, it was clearly eating him alive. By signing this agreement, Thomas would be helping to maintain the very silence that was destroying Tom. He would become part of the machinery that kept truth buried for the sake of protecting powerful people. Thomas asked what would happen if he didn't sign. The room went very quiet. Sir Clive exchanged glances with the security director before responding. He explained that refusing to sign would demonstrate a lack of commitment to the values of royal service. It would suggest that Thomas could not be trusted with sensitive information. His position would become untenable. While they couldn't force him to sign, his continued employment as a royal guard would be impossible if he couldn't provide assurances of his discretion. The implication was clear. Sign or lose your job. Accept the terms or face the consequences. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. He had given 12 years of his life to royal service, worked night shifts and holidays, missed countless family events, all in the name of duty. And now, because he had accidentally overheard something he wasn't supposed to hear, he was being coerced into signing a legal document that would bind him to silence about potential wrongdoing. Thomas took a deep breath and made his decision. He told them he needed time to think, that he couldn't sign something so important without proper consideration. The lawyer's expression hardened. Sir Clive leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. He reminded Thomas that time was not a luxury they had in this situation. Every moment of delay increased the risk of information spreading, of rumors starting, of damage being done to reputations and institutions. But Thomas held firm. He stood up, straightened his uniform, and said clearly that he would not sign the document today. He understood the consequences of his decision and was prepared to accept them. He would submit his resignation from the Royal Guard effective immediately, if that was what they required. But he would not be pressured into signing an agreement he hadn't fully considered. The room erupted in controlled chaos. The security director started to speak, but Sir Clive held up a hand to silence him. The private secretary studied Thomas for a long moment, seeming to reassess the situation. Then he made a proposal. Thomas would be placed on paid administrative leave for 1 week. During that time, he would remain bound by his existing oath of confidentiality to the royal household. He would not discuss what he had heard with anyone outside this room. At the end of the week, they would meet again, and Thomas could provide his final decision about the agreement. It was a compromise, though one that clearly favored the palace. They were buying time, hoping that a week would be enough for Thomas to come to his senses and sign. But it also gave Thomas the space he needed to think clearly, without the immediate pressure of losing his job. He agreed to the terms of the leave and left the room, feeling both relieved and anxious about what he had just done. As Thomas walked through the corridors of Clarence House for what might be the last time, he felt a strange sense of liberation. He had stood up for himself, refused to be bullied into a decision. But he also knew that he had made powerful enemies. The royal household didn't take kindly to staff members who refused to cooperate, who insisted on thinking for themselves rather than simply following orders. Thomas drove home in a daze, his mind replaying the meeting over and over. When he arrived, Sarah was waiting for him. Having sensed from his earlier text that something significant had happened, he told her everything about the meeting, about Sir Clive's appearance, about the ultimatum and his refusal to sign immediately. Sarah's face went pale as she listened, understanding the gravity of the situation they were now in. They spent the evening discussing their options. They could weather the loss of Thomas's income for a while, though not indefinitely. He could look for other security work, though the royal household had connections throughout the industry that might make finding employment difficult if they chose to make things hard for him. Sarah suggested consulting a lawyer of their own, someone who could review the agreement and advise them on their rights. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, unable to sleep for the 3rd night in a row, his phone buzzed with a message. The number was unknown and the text was brief but chilling. The message read simply, "Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Think carefully about your family." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. Thomas showed the message to Sarah, and they both sat in stunned silence. What had started as an accidental overhearing had escalated into something far more sinister. This was no longer just about losing a job. This was a direct threat. Sarah wanted to call the police immediately, but Thomas stopped her. What would they tell the authorities? That he had received a vaguely threatening text after refusing to sign a confidentiality agreement with the royal household? The police would likely dismiss it as a labor dispute or suggest he was overreacting. Worse, involving the police might escalate the situation and make whoever sent the message feel justified in taking further action. Thomas deleted the message and tried to convince himself it was just intimidation, an attempt to scare him into compliance. But sleep remained elusive. Every sound in the night made him jump. Every car that drove past their house made him peek through the curtains. He had entered a world where the normal rules didn't apply, where powerful people could make problems disappear quietly and efficiently. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas was having coffee when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a man in his 60s, well-dressed in a casual way that suggested money without ostentation. The man introduced himself as Gerald Humphreys, a retired journalist who had spent 30 years covering the royal family for various newspapers. He asked if he could come in and talk for a few minutes. Thomas's first instinct was to close the door, but curiosity got the better of him. He invited Gerald inside, and Sarah joined them in the living room. The journalist got straight to the point. Word had reached him through his contacts that something unusual was happening at Clarence House, that a guard had refused to sign a confidentiality agreement and had been placed on leave. Gerald had spent decades building a network of sources within the royal household, and he knew that such actions typically meant something significant was being covered up. Gerald explained that he was no longer in the business of tabloid journalism. He had retired comfortably and spent his time writing books about royal history. But he maintained an interest in truth, particularly when it involved potential abuses of power or cover-ups of wrongdoing. He had seen too many times how the royal machinery crushed ordinary people who got in their way or knew too much. If Thomas had information that deserved to be public, Gerald could help him bring it to light safely. Thomas was immediately suspicious. How did this man know about his situation? Who had told him? Gerald smiled and explained that the royal household leaked like a sieve despite their best efforts at secrecy. There were always staff members who were unhappy, who felt mistreated, who saw things that troubled them. These people talked to each other, and sometimes they talked to journalists they trusted. Gerald had received a call from someone concerned about how Thomas was being treated. Sarah asked what Gerald wanted from them. The journalist was honest. He wanted to know what Thomas had heard, what the palace was so desperate to keep quiet. In exchange, he offered protection of a sort. If Thomas went public with his story, the palace would find it much harder to retaliate against him. Whistleblowers who spoke to the media gained a measure of safety, because harming them afterward would look like obvious revenge. The court of public opinion could be a powerful shield against institutional power. Thomas was torn. Everything in his training told him to refuse to maintain confidentiality, to protect the royal family's privacy. But Gerald's words resonated with the doubts that had been growing in his mind. Why should powerful people be protected from consequences while ordinary people like him faced threats and coercion? What loyalty did he really owe to an institution that treated him as disposable when he became inconvenient? Before Thomas could respond, Gerald added another piece of information that changed everything. He told them that Tom Parker Bowles wasn't the first person connected to this particular secret. 3 years earlier, a palace aide had tried to bring the same information to light. That aide had signed a non-disclosure agreement similar to the one Thomas was being pressured to sign, accepting money in exchange for silence. 6 months later, the aide was found dead in his apartment from an apparent suicide. The coroner ruled it as depression and stress, but Gerald had always suspected there was more to the story. Sarah gasped, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. Gerald quickly clarified that he wasn't suggesting the royal family had ordered anyone's death. These institutions didn't work that way in the modern era, but they had ways of making people's lives unbearable, of isolating them, of destroying their reputations and careers until the pressure became overwhelming. The aide had been blacklisted from employment, had faced legal threats, had lost friends and professional connections. The stress had been immense, and whether the suicide was genuine or not, the palace's treatment of him had certainly contributed to his death. Thomas asked what the secret was. What information was so dangerous that people's lives were destroyed over it? Gerald hesitated, then explained what he had pieced together over the years from various sources. It involved a cover-up from 15 years ago, a scandal that had been carefully buried when it threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels of the royal household. Money had been misappropriated from charitable funds, significant amounts that had been funneled to private accounts. When an investigation had begun, evidence had been destroyed and witnesses had been paid off or intimidated into silence. The official story was that an audit had found minor accounting irregularities that had been corrected, and the matter had been closed. But according to Gerald's sources, the reality was much worse. Several members of the royal household had been involved in systematic theft from charities over a period of years. The amounts were substantial enough that prosecution would have been inevitable if the evidence had been properly examined. Instead, the evidence disappeared and everyone involved closed ranks to protect the institution. Tom Parker Bowles apparently had copies of documents that proved the cover-up. Gerald didn't know exactly how Tom had obtained them, but his sources suggested Tom had been given them by someone with a guilty conscience, someone who couldn't live with what they knew, but was too afraid to come forward themselves. Tom had kept the documents hidden for years, but something had finally pushed him to threaten exposure. His confrontation with Camilla had been about her trying to convince him to destroy the evidence and forget what he knew. Thomas listened to all of this with growing horror. If what Gerald said was true, then the palace wasn't just trying to protect embarrassment or manage public relations. They were actively covering up serious crimes. The non-disclosure agreement wasn't about discretion. It was about making Thomas complicit in a criminal cover-up. By signing it and agreeing that he had heard nothing of substance, he would be helping to obstruct justice. Gerald could see the conflict on Thomas's face. He pressed his advantage, telling Thomas that he had a moral obligation to speak out. Remaining silent made him part of the problem, part of the machinery that allowed the powerful to escape consequences, while ordinary people faced the full weight of the law for minor infractions. This wasn't about betraying the royal family. It was about standing up for basic principles of justice and accountability. But Thomas thought about the threatening text message, about the debt aid, about his wife and children who could become targets if he became a problem that needed to be eliminated. He asked Gerald directly what protection the journalist could really offer. What would stop the palace from destroying his life the same way they had destroyed others? Gerald admitted that the protection was limited. Going public would make obvious retaliation harder, but the royal household had subtle ways of making people suffer. Legal fees from defending against lawsuits, difficulty finding employment, social isolation, constant media scrutiny. Thomas would become a controversial figure, praised by some as a whistleblower and condemned by others as a traitor. His life would never be simple or private again, Sarah interrupted, asking if there wasn't some middle path. Could Thomas not simply refuse to sign the agreement and walk away without going public? Gerald shook his head. The palace couldn't allow someone with this information to remain outside their control without consequences. They would make an example of him either way, whether he spoke out or not. The only question was whether Thomas wanted to suffer in silence or suffer while potentially doing some good by exposing the truth. The journalist stood to leave, telling Thomas to think carefully about his options. He left a business card with a private phone number, urging Thomas to call if he decided he wanted to tell his story. Gerald promised that if Thomas did come forward, he would do everything possible to ensure the story was told accurately, and that Thomas's motivations were properly understood. He would be portrayed not as someone seeking attention or money, but as an ordinary man forced into an impossible situation who chose integrity over comfort. After Gerald left, Thomas and Sarah sat in their living room, both overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before them. Their simple life had been shattered by pure chance by being. Thomas spent the next 2 days in a fog of indecision. He went through the motions of normal life, dropping his daughters at school, helping with homework, preparing meals. But his mind was elsewhere, constantly weighing his options, playing out scenarios, trying to predict consequences. Sarah watched him with growing concern, seeing the stress eat away at the man she loved. On the 3rd day of his administrative leave, Thomas received a phone call from an unexpected source. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, and immediately recognizable. It was Tom Parker Bowles. He apologized for calling directly, explaining that he had gotten Thomas's personal number from a sympathetic member of the household staff. Tom said he needed to meet with Thomas urgently, that there were things Thomas needed to understand before making any decisions. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in Hampstead, far from the usual royal haunts and prying eyes. Thomas arrived early, choosing a corner table where they could talk without being overheard. When Tom walked in 20 minutes later, Thomas was struck by how exhausted he looked. The man was clearly carrying a burden that had worn him down over years of silence. Tom ordered coffee but didn't touch it. He got straight to the point, telling Thomas that he knew about the pressure being applied to sign the confidentiality agreement. He said he was sorry that Thomas had been dragged into this mess, that he had never intended for an innocent guard to become collateral damage in his struggle with his conscience. But now that Thomas was involved, Tom felt responsible for ensuring he understood the full picture. What Gerald Humphreys had told Thomas was essentially accurate, Tom confirmed. The documents he possessed detailed a systematic scheme to divert money from royal charitable foundations into private accounts controlled by senior members of the household staff. The amounts totaled several £1,000,000 over a 5-year period. When internal auditors had begun to notice irregularities, the evidence had been destroyed and the auditors had been pressured into softening their findings to avoid scandal. Tom explained that he had received the documents from his godfather, a man who had worked in the royal household's financial office for decades. The godfather had been dying of cancer and couldn't face death while keeping such secrets. He had given Tom the documents with instructions to use them if the right moment ever came. If exposing the truth could be done in a way that would lead to accountability, rather than simply causing chaos. For years, Tom had kept the documents hidden, unsure what to do with them. He had a comfortable life, children to think about, relationships within the royal family that he valued. His mother had worked hard to gain acceptance and respect in her role as queen consort, and Tom knew that exposing this scandal could damage her reputation by association, even though she hadn't been directly involved in the financial misconduct. But recently, something had changed. Tom had learned that the same people who had orchestrated the original cover-up were now involved in another questionable financial arrangement. They had learned nothing, felt no remorse, and believed they were untouchable. Tom had reached his breaking point. He couldn't stand by and watch the same pattern repeat itself, knowing he had evidence that could stop it, but lacked the courage to come forward. The confrontation with his mother had been Tom's attempt to get her support, or at least her understanding. He had hoped she would see that protecting these people wasn't worth the cost to her own integrity, or to the institution of the monarchy. But Camilla had been focused solely on preventing scandal, on protecting the family's reputation regardless of whether the reputation was deserved. Her response had shown Tom that he couldn't count on family support if he decided to expose the truth. Thomas listened to all of this, understanding why Tom was telling him. The younger man was building his courage to go public, and he wanted Thomas to know that there was real substance behind what he had overheard. This wasn't just a family squabble or emotional exaggeration. There were genuine crimes that had been covered up, and people who should have faced justice had instead walked away wealthy and protected. Tom then made Thomas an offer. If Thomas agreed to serve as a corroborating witness, confirming that he had overheard the conversation and that Tom had mentioned specific evidence, Tom would go to the authorities himself. He would turn over the documents to law enforcement and to Parliament, requesting a full investigation. Having Thomas as a witness would make it harder for the palace to dismiss the whole thing as a vindictive attack or attention-seeking behavior. But Tom was honest about the risks. Both of them would face intense scrutiny. The palace would throw enormous resources into discrediting them, painting them as disgruntled employees seeking revenge or fame. Their lives would be dissected in the media. Every past mistake, every questionable decision, every private moment would be dug up and used to undermine their credibility. Their families would suffer through the attention and criticism. It would be brutal, and there was no guarantee they would win. Thomas asked why Tom thought going public would make any difference. Powerful people had been covering up scandals for centuries and usually got away with it. What made Tom think this time would be different? Tom's answer was surprisingly simple. Because times had changed. The public no longer automatically deferred to the royal family or assumed they could do no wrong. Social media had made it harder to control narratives. There was an appetite for accountability that hadn't existed in previous generations. More importantly, Tom said, staying silent was destroying him. He couldn't live with himself anymore. Couldn't look at his own children without feeling like a hypocrite for teaching them about honesty, while he kept such significant lies. Whether going public succeeded in bringing anyone to justice or not, at least he would know he had tried. At least he could stop being complicit in protecting criminals. Thomas understood that feeling all too well. The past few days had shown him how toxic silence could be, how carrying secrets for powerful people ate away at your sense of self. He thought about his own daughters, about what example he wanted to set for them. Did he want them to learn that the safe path was always the right path? That protecting your own interests mattered more than standing up for what was right? Or did he want them to see that their father had faced a difficult choice and chosen integrity, even when it cost him dearly? Before Thomas could respond, Tom added one more piece of information. He revealed that he wasn't the only person preparing to come forward. There were others in the royal household, current and former staff members who had witnessed various aspects of the financial misconduct or the subsequent cover-up. They had been waiting for someone to break the silence, to create an opening where they could add their voices without being the first target. If Tom came forward and Thomas backed him up, others would follow. Together they could build a case that would be impossible to dismiss or bury. This changed the calculation significantly. Thomas wouldn't be alone facing the palace's wrath. There would be others sharing the burden, corroborating each other's accounts, making it harder for the institution to pick them off one by one. Safety in numbers, as his military father used to say. But it also meant that Thomas's decision would affect other people's willingness to come forward. If he refused to help Tom, those other potential witnesses might stay silent, fearing they couldn't make their case without the guard who had overheard the crucial conversation. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was no longer just about his own conscience or his family's welfare. Other people were counting on him, waiting to see if he would have the courage to stand up. The dead aide that Gerald Humphreys had mentioned, the victims of the financial theft who had never seen justice, Tom Parker Bowles struggling with years of guilty silence, the other staff members waiting nervously for someone to break ranks. They all needed Thomas to be brave. He looked at Tom across the table and saw a reflection of his own turmoil. They were both ordinary men who had stumbled into extraordinary circumstances. Neither of them was a hero or a troublemaker. They were just people trying to do the right thing in a situation where the right thing was neither obvious nor easy. Thomas made his decision in that moment, though he didn't voice it immediately. He needed to talk to Sarah first, to make sure she truly understood what they would be facing and that she was willing to walk this path with him. Tom seemed to sense that Thomas needed time. He stood to leave but paused before going. He told Thomas that whatever decision he made, Tom would respect it and would never blame him for choosing his family's safety over abstract principles of justice. He said that Thomas had already shown more courage than most people by refusing to sign the agreement under pressure. No one could ask more than that. After Tom left, Thomas sat alone in the cafe for a long time, watching people pass by the window. They all looked so normal, so unburdened by impossible choices. He envied them their simple problems, their ordinary concerns about work and bills and what to make for dinner. But he also realized that any of them could find themselves in his position someday. Anyone could witness something they shouldn't, learn information that powerful people wanted hidden, face pressure to choose between safety and integrity. What kind of society would they live? Thomas drove home slowly, taking the long route through streets he had known his entire life. He thought about his childhood in South London, about his parents who had worked hard to give him opportunities. His father's voice echoed in his memory, lessons about honor and duty that had shaped who Thomas had become. His father would have told him to do the right thing regardless of consequences. But his father had never faced a choice quite like this. When Thomas arrived home, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She took one look at his face and turned off the stove. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had made countless family decisions over the years, and Thomas told her about his meeting with Tom. He laid out everything Tom had revealed, the scope of the scandal, the other witnesses waiting to come forward, and the offer to serve as a corroborating witness. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression moving through a range of emotions: fear, anger, resignation, and finally something that looked like determination. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for several minutes, processing everything she had heard. Then she asked him what he wanted to do, not what he thought he should do, but what he truly wanted. Thomas admitted that he wanted to help Tom expose the truth. Every fiber of his being told him that staying silent was wrong, that protecting criminals because they were powerful was a betrayal of everything he believed in. But he was terrified of what it would cost his family. He had never wanted to be a public figure or a whistleblower. He had just wanted to serve honorably and provide for his family. This situation had been thrust upon him by pure chance. Sarah reached across the table and took his hands, just as she had done countless times over their 15 years of marriage. She told him that she had been thinking about what kind of example they wanted to set for their daughters, not just through words but through actions. Their girls were growing up in a world that desperately needed people willing to stand up to power, to speak truth even when it was frightening. If Thomas and Sarah chose silence now, what would they tell their daughters when they were older and asked why their father had stayed quiet about crimes he knew had been committed? She acknowledged the risks they faced. The palace would indeed try to destroy Thomas's reputation. Their family would face scrutiny and criticism. They might lose friends who didn't want to be associated with controversy. Finding new employment could be difficult. Their financial situation would likely become precarious. But Sarah said she would rather face those hardships with a husband who could look himself in the mirror than live comfortably with someone consumed by guilt and regret. Thomas felt tears pricking his eyes. He had known Sarah would support him, but hearing her speak with such certainty about choosing the difficult path made him love her even more deeply. They talked for hours that evening, planning practically for what would come. They would need to hire a lawyer immediately, someone experienced in whistleblower cases who could protect Thomas's rights. They would need to document everything, keeping detailed records of all communications with the palace. They would need to prepare their daughters for what was coming, explaining in age-appropriate terms that their father was doing something important, but that it might be hard for a while. The next morning, Thomas called Tom Parker Bowles and told him he was willing to serve as a witness. Tom's relief was audible even over the phone. They arranged to meet with Tom's lawyer later that week to begin preparing their statement. Tom warned Thomas that once they started this process, there would be no turning back. The palace would know immediately what they were planning, and the pressure would intensify before they even went public. Thomas also called Gerald Humphreys, the retired journalist. While Thomas had decided to go through official legal channels first, having media connections would be important for ensuring the story was told accurately when it eventually became public. Gerald agreed to serve as an advisor, helping Thomas navigate the media landscape and avoid common pitfalls that destroyed whistleblowers' credibility. The call Thomas dreaded most was to Sir Clive Alderton at the palace. He needed to inform them that he would not be signing the confidentiality agreement and that he intended to cooperate with any legitimate investigation into the matters he had overheard. The private secretary's response was ice-cold. He informed Thomas that he was making a catastrophic mistake that would ruin his life and accomplish nothing. The palace had weathered far worse scandals than this, and they had the resources to ensure that Thomas's accusations went nowhere. Sir Clive made one final offer. If Thomas reconsidered and signed the agreement within the next 24 hours, they would pretend this entire episode had never happened. His job would be secure, the financial compensation would be doubled, and no retribution would follow. But if Thomas persisted in his current course, the palace would have no choice but to defend itself vigorously against his allegations. They would examine every aspect of his life and career, looking for any mistakes or improprieties that could undermine his credibility. It was a final warning disguised as an offer. Thomas declined firmly and ended the call. The die was cast. He contacted a lawyer specializing in employment and whistleblower cases, a woman named Jennifer Blackwell, who had successfully represented several people who had taken on powerful institutions. Jennifer reviewed the situation and agreed to represent Thomas, warning him that it would be a long and difficult battle, but that he had a strong case based on what he described. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Tom worked with their lawyers to prepare comprehensive statements. Other witnesses began coming forward as promised, each adding pieces to the puzzle. A former accountant provided records that corroborated the financial irregularities. A retired household manager confirmed that evidence had been destroyed during the original investigation. A current staff member testified to intimidation tactics used to silence people who asked uncomfortable questions. The palace's response was exactly as Tom had predicted. Stories began appearing in friendly media outlets questioning Thomas's mental stability, his job performance, his motivations. Anonymous sources claimed he had been a difficult employee with a grudge. His financial records were somehow leaked to journalists with emphasis on debts and late payments to make him look desperate for money. Old mistakes from his youth were dug up and presented as evidence of poor character. Sarah faced harassment at her job as rumors spread about her husband. The girls came home from school in tears after classmates repeated things their parents had said about Thomas being a traitor or a liar. It was brutal and exhausting, exactly as they had been warned it would be. But the family held together, supporting each other through the worst moments, reminding themselves why they had chosen this path. The turning point came when Tom Parker Bowles formally submitted his evidence to Parliament and requested an investigation. The documents he provided were damning, showing a clear pattern of financial misconduct and subsequent cover-up. Several members of Parliament, particularly those already skeptical of royal spending and accountability, seized on the case and demanded action. The palace could no longer simply dismiss the allegations as the complaints of disgruntled employees. A formal inquiry was launched, with powers to compel testimony and examine records. Thomas was called to testify about what he had overheard, providing the crucial link between Tom's documentary evidence and the current royal household's knowledge of the crimes. His testimony was measured and careful, sticking to exactly what he had heard without embellishment or speculation. Even hostile questioners had difficulty undermining his credibility because he was so clearly not seeking attention or benefit from his testimony. The investigation took months, but eventually a report was issued confirming that serious financial misconduct had occurred and that evidence had been improperly destroyed to prevent accountability. Several individuals were identified as having participated in the scheme, though many had already retired or died. Criminal charges were brought against 2 people who were still alive and provable. It wasn't everything Thomas had hoped for, but it was more justice than there would have been if he had stayed silent. The palace issued a formal apology and implemented new oversight mechanisms for royal charitable foundations. King Charles made a public statement expressing disappointment in those who had betrayed the trust placed in them and committing to transparency going forward. It was a carefully worded statement that accepted minimal responsibility while trying to contain the damage. For Thomas and Sarah, life slowly began to normalize, though it would never be quite the same. Thomas found new work in private security, with an employer who valued his integrity rather than seeing it as a liability. The family had to relocate to a different area to escape the ongoing attention, but they found a new community that welcomed them. The girls adjusted to their new school, and eventually the teasing stopped as other news dominated public attention. Tom Parker Bowles maintained a low profile after the investigation concluded, having accomplished what he set out to do. He sent Thomas a brief note thanking him for his courage and expressing hope that they had made some small difference in holding power accountable. Thomas kept the note in his desk drawer, a reminder of the show.